Welcome to another episode of the Robinson Hewitt podcast. This is where we talk about the anthropology of technology, futuristic idealism, and how to build a better future for everybody. So I'm your host, Alison Mackey. I am a futurist, a water governance director, anthropologist of emerging technology, and founder of Robinson Hewitt Consulting. So what do? We're all about transforming the traditional with the unseen for the next era of innovation and ideas. And we love to blend anthropological insight with future systems thinking. So all of this together today is to bring you the topic of transportation and fuel. That doesn't sound like a super interesting topic, but to me personally, I think it is fascinating to think about how we transport ourselves and how it just kind of intercepts our society and our global community as well. So I think it's kind of like a really great topic to kind of talk about because right now the entire globe is facing a fuel crisis. So we're starting to see that things are getting a little bit tricky for people at the moment. I personally got rid of my car. I sold my car about like 2 years ago. And I used to be the person that used to think, you will pry my car away from me when I die. Like I loved my little Golf. And I used to have this belief system that if I had a car, I would always be free. And since I sold my car, I've learned that actually that's not the case. I have two beautiful feet that work pretty great. And it's actually quite fun to go and walk through the city and find new things and discover new things. And I wouldn't have had that if I had my car. So that's my little 2 cents right there for you. We're starting to see this like tension between an old system and a new one, right? We're running out of time with the old one. We're literally built on fossil fuels. And so now we get to ask the beautiful question of what gets to replace it? How are we going to transport ourselves in the future? What does this do to the economy? And what does it mean to be human if we aren't relying on fossil fuels? So I want to kind of, again, bring in a movie into the loop of this because I love a movie as an exemplar. If we think about Back to the Future, right? Flying cars, time machines, I love it. So if we think about at the end of the first movie, when Dr. Brown comes back from the future, he says, where we're going, we won't need roads. And he's kind of like shoving rubbish into like the DeLorean, right? And it just allows you to think a little bit differently of, oh my gosh, what if we had flying cars that were built off, rubbish, off banana skins and apple peels? What does that look like? How do we build that? I'm not the first to think of this, obviously, and I won't be the last, but I just thought today would be a great episode to kind of have a little bit of a play and a think about how do we build a strategy to get there today. So the current state of play and why this matters now. So right now, we are starting to see the early effects of a fuel-constrained world. So fossil fuels that we rely on for the majority of our transportational needs, by their very nature, are finite, right? So fossil fuels are ancient compressed biological matter. And as we are drawing closer and closer to our limits of these sources, we're starting to see the ripple effects of this everywhere across society. So we're seeing rising costs in fuel, and that then gets trickled down into pressuring into the global supply food chain and supply chain in general. And we're also seeing a fragility in how people and our resources move. And so what's interesting with this is that transport in general just like becomes strained and everything else seems to follow. It's such a domino effect. And movement underpins trade, access, and opportunity. And when it tightens, the system tightens with it. We've built the system around us where we rely on transport for our day-to-day interactions, for living our lives and having what has we've become used to, right? And so we've been used to this globalized economy, and now we're starting to see, oh, actually, with this has all been based on fossil fuels, and I don't think this can last much longer. So I actually see that we will start to see this shift in a period of time where travel becomes decreased. I don't think this is like a permanent thing. I think this is a sort of a rubber band effect of just needing to put a pause on, hey, can we think about a better way of transporting things? I think air travel is going to become a lot more selective and road transport becoming a lot more expensive as well. And I think that nations that rely heavily on export will start to rethink strategies of how they can inject into their economies. I think it's going to be, I mean, we've seen this with tariffs as well. There's been this sort of nudge at the moment to move away from exports and look more locally. Look in your own backyard. What can you plant for yourself, and what can you do to support someone else's initiatives in your own community, right? We might need to start looking at local manufacturing, local food systems, and local resilience to kind of navigate this era of, oh my God, what is happening? So on the ground, this can look like us cycling a lot more. I'm seeing that more families are starting to use Lime scooters in groups. It's actually quite fun, especially over the long weekend that we've just had. I've seen a lot of people traveling in groups on Lime scooters, and I just think it's so funny now that there's less cars on the road. And it's so funny once you take something away. How do people navigate that? And so I've seen so many people in the city streets on Lime scooters and e-bikes, and I just think it's kind of great, actually. Maybe not forever, but for the short term, it's been quite fun. People are, I've seen on like the New Zealand subreddit, a lot of people are talking more and more about like, the train system, ferry systems, people getting annoyed when the buses are being like, there's more discourse around public transportation at the moment, at least in my backyard, which is fantastic to see. I think when we have this little shift away and a little break in the pattern of like, hey, there's other resources we can use, save fuel for other people. I think it's a great collective mindset shift. But for the moment, I do feel like, the discourse that I've seen online, people are feeling like we're taking a step back and, asking bigger questions of our sort of more local government initiatives. Why aren't they doing more? And I just feel like that's such like a rubber band effect of like, when we go through transitions and systems and things like that, there is like chaos in the messy middle, right? So I feel like if you can just like hold your breath for like a slight second, thinking about this from an anthropological perspective, we've seen this before. It's not regression, it's just transition, and yeah, it will all settle down. It just takes a moment for people to get used to things again, right? But it happens when one system begins to unwind. Before the next one is like fully ready to like take its place. And that is where all the genius ideas come from, by the way. So I'm very excited to see who comes up with what during this era of time when we are taking a look away from fossil fuels and into the future. But before we take a look into the future, I think it's always really important to take a look back in time to look at the patterns and lessons that we can learn. So if you look at history, there's a very consistent pattern. And during economic downturns, governments turn to infrastructure, especially transport, as a way to reignite momentum and inject cash into the economy. So I'm going to talk about this next exemplar totally neutrally from a very objective historical standpoint. Take it or leave it. I think if you know me, you know where I side on history and current affairs. But after the Treaty of Versailles and during the Great Depression, Germany, despite having been heavily constrained because of the Treaty of Versailles and the parameters around that after World War One, they became the first country to actually get themselves out of economic downturn during the Great Depression. That shouldn't have been the case though. What this came down to was their investment in transport. They were developing early versions of what became the Volkswagen as well as building the Autobahn. So they built a product and then they built something for the product to be on. They made it special, right? So they didn't just create cars, they created jobs for their population, a product that people could aspire to own, as well as infrastructure that could actually use the product, right? So the combination of all of this, of production, access, and infrastructure is incredibly powerful. Another example of this actually shows up a little bit earlier in time with Henry Ford. And he didn't invent the car, he didn't do any of that, but he did change everything about how it was made and who it was for. And he was known to be a bit of an asshole to his engineers. And I actually kind of love this because I've been around engineers my entire life and tech people, and one of my favorite things to do is to just kind of tell them like, you know too much. You need to forget about things. And I have this theory that we were going in the future, we almost need to break physics a little bit. And I feel like if you know something so well, it's hard to break your learnings of that. But the greatest physicists in the world, they always try to just prove what they've proven, right? So I feel like that's like a little hint of a nod towards Henry Ford and my love for not him in general, but just like his way of kind of producing things and like the trickle-on effect and what we can learn from him. He didn't change anything, right? But the assembly line of how you produce things, make things cheaper, faster to produce, higher wages, right? A really good, decent living wage and enabling workers to actually buy the products that they were making. That was revolutionary and amazing. So this is what we call Fordism, and it's to mass produce things and have that be paired with consumption. Is this a problem with capitalism? Yes, but when we're trying to inject things into the economy, this can sometimes be a really good approach. Do I think it's the approach of the future? No. We're talking about 120 odd years ago here, and I just want to say this is the pattern that we've been facing and why people tend to go towards infrastructure and producing things when it comes to like more of a central community of things, right? So Fordism is really important when we're looking back at history when it comes to transportation because it reshapes society and where, how things were made. So we showed that cars were no longer just a luxury item. We had suburbs that expanded and mobility became personal and individual. So this is really important because it does show how transportation isn't just an individual thing. It really does trickle on to the broader impact of society and humanity. We now have this like beginnings of the white picket fence reality, right? Am I advocating for another like punch into like consumerism and capitalism? Absolutely not. If you know me, you know that I'm quite like a community-led person. But I think it's a really interesting thing to look at of, hey, maybe we should think about a new approach to transportation because it has been known to kind of inject into the economy. And where we're going, I think that, I'm in little old New Zealand and we rely heavily on exports. And I think that if we want to kind of like think about the future, I think New Zealand would be a really great space to kind of think about something new. I'm just going to leave that seed out there for someone to plant it. But anyways, let's talk about the future. Okay, so going back to the future, let's talk about some futuristic concepts and some technology. So if we step outside of a normal paradigm and we look a little bit broader, we forget about physics, we forget about science, we just play with imagination and ask what if. Let's think about what would it look like? So a little while ago, I wrote about flying cars. And if you know me, you know that I have like theories and ideas from writing stories over the years of like how this could look like when it comes to like crystals or like electromagnetic fields and things like that. Okay, so the mental exercise that I like to play with when I do this like sort of futuristic idealism thing is to think about a different version of Earth and think about the butterfly effect. So what is a version of Earth where they already have this problem solved? They have all the technology, they've already got the greatest minds working on this. What does it look like? How did they solve it? Then we work backwards from there, right? So how would they do it? Historically, some of the biggest breakthroughs haven't come from improving existing systems, but from removing all assumptions completely. And so this is why today I would love to think about what if we removed fossil fuels? What if we removed roads? What would it look like? How would we transport ourselves? So I believe that we already have hints of this technology advancements happening right now. So we've already had some research into advanced materials, as well as energy storage, and even concepts of nuclear diamond batteries. And this is where small amounts of radioactive material are encased in diamond structures, able to produce a continuous electrocurrent over a long period of time. So this can last, I think it's about 2,000 years worth of energy is stored within these nuclear batteries. It's a bit controversial, and I think it still needs some work doing. But once you crack the battery issue, everything opens, right? But this isn't just like a complete solution right now, but it does open the door of, well, if we've solved the battery problem with these nuclear diamond batteries and free source energy, what is possible? And I love to think about that. So if we have these nuclear batteries that people are working on at the moment, what does it look like? How do we build this new relationship with materials, our environment, and energy? So let's stretch our minds a little bit further and let's go into the spectrum of possibilities. So, on the ground end, let's think about it, right? We have autonomous vehicles operating on demand systems, similar to rideshare, but without the drivers. We are starting to see ideas of this happen at the moment, although kind of clunky. So, moving a little bit more further outward and a little bit more futuristic, this idea of having small personal aircrafts. Some, I reckon, similar to like, it's like the Jeffersons, right? Those little vehicles. I don't know what to call them. Does anyone have any ideas on that? Let me know. But that idea of being able to move between communities, right? That's what we think about with the DeLorean. That's the Back to the Future sort of vehicle. And what about short distance travel? Again, bringing in this idea of Back to the Future of small little portable hoverboards that are just hovering off the ground just a little bit, and they make you move between your destinations. And this is where I start to think about how do we get to this place, right? And this is where I think that there is a little bit of secret sauce in electromagnetic fields. And understanding the magnets of the earth and how do we use energy against what we have naturally available to us with gravity? How do we break physics in a way that we can actually create hoverboards? But for long distance travel, I think it could involve something incredibly fast, quiet airbuses. Similar to what we see in Star Wars, I just have a feeling that's the way that we could evolve into. I feel like if we see this uptake more and more in public transportation, I feel like the idea of an airplane might change a little bit to be more like a train in the sky almost, just for those little shorter commutes. But for more global, like traveling across the planet, I kind of see a little bit more of like airplanes as we know them, but changed a little bit so they're a little bit more aerodynamic. But again, I think that if we can crack the batteries and we can crack the materials, I think that we can see transportation completely shift and help us create global hubs in a way that we haven't seen it before. But if we go even further and think about the ideas of teleportation, the kind that we see in Star Trek, or my favorite, Spaceballs, I think that needs more than just new technology. I think that needs a completely different understanding of physics, of consciousness, of time, space, time, as well as matter. And it would have to redefine what we know, what it means to be human. And I think that would need us to think a little bit more on an esoteric perspective, but that's for another day. But for today, I think we leave it at the edge and we acknowledge that that is part of a broader imaginative field. And I don't think everyone is quite ready for that conversation. But let me know if you are interested in hearing a little bit more about my ideas on teleportation, because I got a few. So bringing this all into today's context and how do we get there? How do we build a future where transportation is regenerative and not extractive, is built on resilience and community and all of that, right? How do we get there? So the important thing to know is that even the most futuristic outcomes don't appear overnight. They emerge in layers and they take time, right? Everything always works in layers, and we're in the early stages of this now. So think about how quickly e-scooters and e-bikes and rideshare platforms all came normal. There were a few wobbles at first, and I think there was a lot to do with regulation, safety, and social adaptation. But we share sidewalks with scooters without even thinking twice now, right? So there is a cultural shift as much as a technological one. But we're also seeing early steps towards these autonomous vehicles, which begin to shift this idea of ownership to access. So you don't need to own the car, but you just need access to movement when you need it. So all of these small changes are all pointing in the right direction. They're moving away from individual ownership towards shared systems, away from fuel dependence into electrification and beyond, new forms of energy sources and new ways of dealing with materials. And we're also moving away from fixed infrastructure towards flexible movement. And this has a ripple-on effect towards not only how we transport ourselves, but how we engage with resources, how we build our communities. I'm a huge fan of the 20-minute city. So all of this will also have a trickle-on effect of how we engage with each other in communities, buying locally, food shops. Are we going to move towards more local things? Who knows? So how do we crawl, walk, run our way into building this future? So right now we can think of ourselves as being at the crawl stage, and this is all about adaptation. We're using what we already have, but in a different way, and we're starting to see breaks in the chains of our patterning and needing to rethink how we do things. And if we see a more global impact of this, I think it's really important to start thinking about shopping a little bit more locally. Start thinking about different ways of getting to work, getting to school, getting kids used to walking as well. A little bit of advice from someone who started walking everywhere. Your feet need time to adjust, so buy good shoes. So the walk phase is like the next step in our evolution of building the future. So, and this is where things start to integrate. So we're starting to see autonomous systems at scale. We might see new energy technologies such as the nuclear batteries come about and be integrated into society, and people getting used to that mass amount of energy and the potentials of that. We'll also start to see our infrastructure shift. So this won't just be roads, it will also be different like transportational hubs, networks, and different layers of transport systems that work together. I think there will be like new applications similar to Uber, all about how do we share rides and things like that. Okay, and so when the run phase happens, this is when we see everything shift. So once we have new technologies and new sources of energy that isn't reliant on fossil fuels, and we're starting to learn all the lessons and trial and error with this technology, I feel like this is where it's going to totally thrive and be so exciting. I feel like there will be so much more excitement in terms of transportation and the freedom that that allows. And I think that transport in the future will become on demand. I feel like this idea of like, do you really want a car and the admin uptake of all of that? Or is it better to have a community driven sort of initiative with that, where you're sharing a ride and not having something that's collecting dust in the garage? But I do think that, I feel like it's one of those things of when you're going without something, you're like, oh, did I actually even need that? I feel like if you have a community pool of transportation in the future of these like really high tech devices, it's almost like having this like private jet sort of a situation where you kind of like chip in. That's what I feel like it could be. Um, something similar to that. So I think there's something a little bit more happening beneath the surface of this rather than just running out of fossil fuels. I think this is a really great opportunity to start to rethink and reshape how we transport ourselves, as well as have the opportunity to kind of like reconnect with our local roots and start to becoming closer to our own environments and our own communities. So the more advanced that we become, the more that we do tend to have a return back to something more simpler. If you think about really luxurious brands like the Row, you don't know that it's the Row. That's like what is that saying? It's like rich screams but wealthy whispers, right? That's kind of the idea when it comes to technological advancements. So the more that we advance technologically, I believe that the more and more we're actually see this shift towards more local, more shared, and more connected ideas of the future. But I want to leave you with something to think about over the next couple of weeks. Building the future doesn't start with solving problems in front of you. Sometimes it's about removing assumptions and asking what becomes possible once we remove something. So think about that. What does the future look like without fossil fuels? What does the future look like without roads? How do we transport ourselves? Will your business flourish? How will you navigate the world? Will you need to be growing your own garden instead? What does it look like? Just start thinking about these things. And, maybe next time we'll go dive a little bit deeper into that idea of breaking physics and consciousness and time, space, time, continuum, and teleportation. But we'll leave that for another day. So where we're going, we might not need roads, but we still might need them for a little bit longer. But that was today's podcast episode. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it leaves you thinking, what will it mean to be human in the next era of transportation without fossil fuels? And if you would like more information about Robinson Hewitt Consulting, you can check out our resources available on our website, as well as our services. And I will see you in the next one. Ciao.